Afternoon to everybody. My name is André Biancarelli. I'm professor here at Institute of Economics at Unicamp. I have the task to chair this session number, I don't remember the number, 7. Carbon pricing, carbon taxes, and cap and trade systems. Thank you everybody for coming here. It's a pleasure to have here very important speakers, and we will start with our invited Michael Ash because he's online, and we decided to alter the order here. So Michael Ash will present here to us. He's professor of economics and public policy at UMass Amherst and co-director Corporate Toxics Information Project at the Political Economy Research Institute. Michael, you have the floor for 15 to 20 minutes, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to join you. So I'm going to talk about carbon pricing and carbon taxation, and what are sometimes called, but I will raise questions, cap and trade systems. So my signal is clear? So most of us agree that carbon emissions have to stop soon. And let's see, I'm going to share with you. What you can see here are emission pathways needed to achieve different temperature targets. So you can see where we are at about 2025. And if we want to have an emissions pathway that's compatible with 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is becoming increasingly a difficult prospect, this is what the emission pathway in gigatons of carbon dioxide needs to look like. By roughly 2070, we need to be at zero emissions. This is a very rapid drawdown that's required. There will be substantial benefits from the transition to a post-fossil renewable system, including, of course, a critical intervention to reduce the buildup of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which is already responsible for impacts of climate change and will increase in danger over the coming century. Other benefits of transition to a post-fossil renewable energy system include enormous reductions in local pollution, which are co-pollutants of carbon dioxide when fossil fuels are combusted. And there's enormous potential for public health improvements. Local co-pollutants of fossil fuel combustion probably kills on the order of 10 million people per year globally, with roughly 60% of those deaths in India and China. So reducing fossil fuels will also reduce the co-pollutants that are produced with fossil fuels. The post-fossil renewable energy system also holds the possibility, which will depend on both politics and policy, of developing a cheaper and less centralized energy system. The fossil system places large fuel cost burdens on countries without fossil fuel production and on working people worldwide. Fossil fuel system has been the site of enormous economic and political inequality, beginning with Rockefeller's Standard Oil, with no abatement in the era of ExxonMobil and Aramco. The new system certainly has no guarantee of being cheaper, more egalitarian, or less centralized. That's always a matter of social relations, not the technology itself. But many of the new energy technologies, including wind, solar, storage, and efficiency, potentially require less centralization than do the dominant energy forms of the past century: fossil extraction, fossil combustion facilities, large-scale hydro and nuclear. Hydroelectric and nuclear are low carbon sources, but they have significant other socio-ecological problems. Finally, the transition itself has the potential to provide a Keynesian boost in employment and income, and to accelerate innovation in efficient and replicable technology in the research, development, learning, and dissemination that occurs during the transition. So fair sharing of the cost of transition and the benefits and costs of the new energy system will require political mobilization and policy design. For example, analyzing the potential distribution of the benefits of co-pollutant reductions or co-benefits, we have found that attention to the spatial location of co-pollutant reduction can make or fail to make a major intervention in the distribution of public health benefits of decarbonization. In terms of a timely transition, and this is very important, administered fossil phase-outs will almost certainly be necessary to meet something resembling an acceptable timeline and pathway in the emissions pathway figure. We're going to need to administer getting rid of carbon. It is possible that renewable energy and energy efficiency will fall so sharply in price and rise so quickly in quality and accessibility that fossil energy is simply displaced. But there are good reasons to suspect the transition will be slow and prolonged. Let me give a couple of reasons. Carbon using capital, like power plants, cars, trucks, ships, planes, industrial smelters, and ovens, are long-lived, and they're transportable, and they're active resale markets. There was a state-of-the-art 2009 combined heat and power fossil combustion facility at UMass Amherst. It's installed with at least a 30 and possibly 50-year lifespan. So even in the global north, cash-strapped public university like mine faces significant pressure to continue the use of fossil-burning assets. Used fossil combustion machinery can be easily sold on resale markets. Fossil fuels themselves are likely to be available for many decades, and to the extent renewable and energy efficiency transition reduces demand for fossil fuels, the remaining demand will draw from fossil reserves with low marginal extraction costs. So we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels, I think, just by pushing them off the stage because they're obsolete. I might also point out in passing, it's a bit of a novelty observation, but almost every historical form of energy, wood, coal, you name it, the old forms of energy, is in current global use at its peak level. So unlike buggy whips or horse blankets, the old energy sources do not disappear, forced from the scene. We're going to need to force them from the scene. And there are some reasons for that. With energy, the new can coexist with the old. The old may fill particular niches or contribute energy because a joule is a joule is a joule. So while the share of fossil fuels may fall, the amount of the absolute level may not, and that is relevant for carbon, for greenhouse gas emissions. I got a taste of this. I got the picture when I was driving across West Texas last summer 2024, and through the windshield at a single instant, we could see fracking rigs, oil derricks bobbing, scores of windmills on distant buttes in the distance, and vast utility-scale solar arrays. It was a complete all-of-the-above energy landscape ready to feed apparently insatiable energy appetites. And then there's, of course, also the new demand for electricity, insatiable with the advent of AI servers. I can say more in questions if that's of interest. So it seems more likely than the absence of intervention, fossil fuels will continue to play an important role, and that's a disaster. They must go if we're going to preserve the planet, as you can see in the diagram in front of you. So we're going to have an administered fossil phase down. And here's what that leads to. The notion of an administered fossil phase down immediately demands that we inquire, administered by whom, how, and at what scale or scales. The scale of administration could be subnational, national, regional, or global. An additional important consideration in administered phase down is whether the phase down can be designed to maximize co-benefits in terms of public health and environmental justice. I can return to that. I think I need to move forward. But poor design could actually aggravate public health and environmental injustice if the reductions in fossil fuel use are very uneven. Administration can take many forms. Replacement of fossil fuels by the renewable revolution obviously requires, if it just happens by itself, requires less administration, even though nonetheless the cleanup of fossil fuel extraction, transportation, processing, distribution, disposal may prove a significant task. Otherwise, we're going to have a plan to phase out, to prohibit, to reduce, and eventually to prohibit the extraction and use of fossil fuels if we want to preserve the atmosphere, acceptable atmosphere and temperature bounds. We're going to need to phase out fuels at about 10%, fossil fuel at about 10% per year. All right, so it's worth noting that this analysis is concerned with the emission of real physical carbon. Historic carbon responsibility is enormously important. The United States is responsible for approximately 1/4 of all historic carbon emissions, but it currently emits only about 12 to 15% of global output. So the control problem that I want to talk about, central to my analysis today, is to eliminate current emissions. Assigning and facing responsibility for historic emissions is deeply important. It could be part of a just transition system, but the US, if it got rid of all of its carbon, would only be getting rid of 12 to 15% share of global emissions. So we need to think about actual carbon that's being emitted. We can also talk about historic responsibility. Okay, so here are some alternative administration instruments, how to carry out this, the administered reduction of carbon. So, for example, taxation, Pigouvian taxation, is a potential administrative instrument for the reduction of fossil fuel use and the assignment of the right to use fossil fuels. So, to use fossil fuels, one would pay a tax. So the pricing discussed here, either in terms of taxation or below in terms of a price induced by a permitting system, dips into the dubious waters of the social cost of carbon. That seeks to identify a price for carbon that reflects the social cost and social benefit associated, willingness to pay for climate change moderation. Social cost of carbon is, in my opinion, a disaster, a dead end, cul-de-sac. It has issues of discounting, distribution, risk aversion, growth, and other problems associated with integrated assessment models. In contrast, the permitting and taxation systems discussed in this paper are purely instruments for achieving a scientifically derived decarbonization pathway, like the one you see before you, or the pathways that you see before you. If we want those pathways, we could use taxation or permitting to those taxways. So the instruments discussed here do not determine the socially desired pathway. That is, to my mind, a matter of science and precaution. Okay, so taxation is a possibility. Caps or permitted caps are a different administrative instrument for the reduction of fossil fuel use and the assignment of the right to use fossil fuels. Caps could be assigned, for example, by auction of permits to use fossil fuels. And if caps are assigned by auction, then the distinction between taxation and auction permits may be relatively small. In principle, taxes and auction permits are equivalent, but taxation could provide price precision with a price that requires estimated or trial and error adjustments to achieve the desired quantity. While permits provide quantity precision, with a quantity selected in line with the desired phase-out quantity, and price emerges from effectively consumers' effective willingness to pay for the available quantity. While on the surface these might seem very similar, there might also be a preference for a scientifically set permit quantity that is set within the bounds of atmospheric capacity, not relying on guesses about elasticities of demand. With either taxation or auction permits, or indeed any administration of fossil combustion, there is concern about what strictures will be honored in the breach. For example, auction permit systems might generate very high carbon prices in very short order, and those could generate significant political resistance, popular or elite. And then they might be subjected to, the permitting quantities might be subjected to circuit breakers or a maximum carbon price. Well, we're not going to let it, even though the permit says it ought to be at $200 a ton, we're not going to let go to $200 a ton. So while permitting might on the surface seem like a more reliable quantitative intervention, and it is my preference, it could also prove no more reliable than a tax calibrated to limit demand for fossil fuels to an ecologically acceptable level. So instruments for carbon reduction are not limited to taxes or auction permits. Permits could be assigned, raising the question of assigned to whom, and as a corollary, assigned with what degree of fungibility. If you have a permit, can you sell it? And the administration question arrives at this key point of the analysis. There will be a value attached to the right to use fossil fuels during their administered phase out. So unless you think that fossil fuels will be gone almost instantly, there will be a value attached to who gets to use them while they're phased out. The phase out will be geared, one hopes, to the protection of the atmosphere. And this has been, you can conceptualize this, if you like, as an atmospheric scarcity rent. There's a certain amount of atmosphere left over that can be used for carbon without destroying the plant too badly, the green line. And the access to that right has a value attached to it. But you can also think of it as the value of the right to access to fossil fuels over and above the cost of extraction, processing, and transportation during a period of administered limitation on their use. Most people are not allowed to use carbon anymore. Some people are. What's the value of that right? Assuming fossil fuels remain a useful and valued fuel source, which is likely, I've argued, the administration of the right to use fossil fuels entails the assignment of the value to the holder of the right. Fossil fuel phase out will necessarily generate scarcity rents. There are alternative dispositions of the scarcity rent associated with the right to use fossil fuels during the phase down. One option, which could be labeled the polluter doesn't pay principle, would allocate permits to historic polluters. This has been done with things like sulfur dioxide permits in the US. A typical allocation is on the basis of shares of prior output or pollution, with the total allocation or cap ratcheted down at the intended pace of phase out. So there's only a certain amount that the planet can handle. We'll give that rights to that to existing polluters. That's a terrible idea. I'll explain why. This assignment mechanism is typically paired with marketability of the permits, so-called cap and trade. There's a cap. The permits are handed out to existing polluters, and then firms receiving the allocation can use their preferred package of changing their emissions, exercising some or all of their allocated permits, and then selling excess permits, or they can even buy additional permits. Thus, in addition to enshrining the principle that polluters don't pay, cap and trade also requires an instrument trading apparatus and full commodification of carbon permits that is likely to become a domain of service fees and speculation. I think there's a very unattractive prospect. The trading apparatus will ensure a cut for Wall Street while also creating barriers for decarbonization implementation. Allocation of the scarce resource to use fossil fuels to existing polluters has several serious drawbacks, not limited to the polluter doesn't pay. In any case, it's crucial to appreciate the assignment of value accrues in the first instance to the existing polluters, and that, in my opinion, is unacceptable. Other dispositions of the scarcity rent are possible. If the scarcity rent is collected via taxation or permit auction, then the proceeds of the tax or the auction could, for example, finance a reallocation of taxes. In the US, some have suggested using carbon tax proceeds to reduce the personal income tax or payroll taxes. As many economists emphasize the deadweight loss of those taxes, there's been discussion of whether a double dividend is possible, and that would be one direction to go. However, I would note that the US personal income tax is already progressive, and displacing it with the carbon tax would likely be regressive. So another use that one might do of these sold permits or tax proceeds would be to create a green investment pool, which would speed energy transition. So I think it's helpful if I just take a moment here. How am I doing on time?
2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
2 minutes, okay. So I will skip some observations about how the tax might work. I think it's helpful to have some parameters. The tax might be on the order of $80 per ton of carbon dioxide. That is for that. So a very useful translation of $80 per ton of carbon dioxide is dollars. Carbon dioxide is equivalent to cents per gallon of gasoline. For those of you who work in that quantity system. So the revenue, a problem is that the revenue collection for carbon pricing is regressive, because while rich people use more carbon and hence pay more in carbon pricing than do poor people, the use of carbon is less than proportional with income or wealth. Carbon resembles most other forms of consumption, so carbon taxation, like consumption or sales taxes, is regressive. This problem especially confronts proposals to use the carbon revenue for offsetting other forms of taxation or investment pool. The regressive pay-in, however, could be offset. The regressive pay-in could be offset with what some have termed carbon dividends or cap and dividend. So it would be possible to take the pool of funds generated by selling carbon permits or carbon taxation and simply distributing them on a per capita basis to each person participating in the carbon price system. And I will skip the progressiveness of that because I'd like to cover some issues that I think are very important to this particular conference. First is that the polity or boundary for a carbon pricing system is an important consideration. National implementation is probably the most tractable. Large federated countries like Brazil, Germany, the US, Canada could conceivably do local systems, but large is probably better. But an attractive feature of this system is that it turns out to be quite progressive at any scale. So a national scale cap and dividend system would be progressively redistributed. It would attract the potentially political support of about 2/3 of the population of low, middle income, or high income countries. And instead of beginning with an international agreement and trying to implement downward like COP, it was a fully self-supporting system that should attract significant majority support in countries one at a time. So that's attractive. Secondly, maybe especially attractive for less developed countries. So first, the dividend-based cash transfer, taking the proceeds of the sale and distributing them, will be especially progressive and especially beneficial in situations with extreme poverty. The public health co-benefits of co-pollutant reduction will be larger in developing economies with high air pollution, notably India and China. In the case of incomplete but monopolistic rural electrification, it would pave the way rapidly towards decentralized adoption of renewables. And finally, clean energy subsidies are often upward biased in their incidence, pocketed by richer households. Per capita uniform distribution would be downward biased, more progressive, and providing relief to poorer households. I want to talk about a handful of other considerations, and then I will stop. I apologize. I'd like to distinguish once again between cap and trade and cap and dividend. There is no need for trading in an effectively implemented cap and dividend system. The point is not commodification, but rather valuing nature and struggling over a value that really can't be avoided. The value exists during the process of decarbonization. Second, offsets, which I think my colleague Jimena Aristizábal will discuss in the next session, are to be avoided at all costs. And I will not say more about them. Jimena has plenty to say. Third, trade and carbon border price adjustments need attention. I expect this concern about border price adjustments will be very important for participants in this in this conference. It arises because, while I said earlier that a polity can adopt carbon pricing to majoritarian domestic advantage, the question of trading between countries that do or don't have carbon pricing could create both a return that goods and services with embedded carbon haven't been appropriately taxed, but also significant concerns about gaming that system, effectively creating a carbon tariff that's almost exclusively protectionist by rich countries. And I have to say the US and EU carbon border adjustment mechanisms have many aspects that have the whiff of protectionism about them. So I think it's important not to minimize the problem of abusive carbon border adjustment, but there are several mitigating factors. First, some of the concern is justified. Countries should from seeking a competitive edge by lax decarbonization efforts. Second, energy content is a reasonably small part of the content of much goods, about 8% or below for many goods. Exceptions are aluminum, cement, some paper products. Third, international coordination and harmonization, if it came about, bottom up, would relax this problem, and there might even be conceivably a race to the top as countries decide to implement a carbon tax domestically rather than pay into a different country's carbon price adjustment system. So I don't think that the border adjustment problem is intractable. To sum up, there's enormous value in access to carbon during decarbonization transition. The more rapid and complete the transition, the more rapid the abolition of this value. However, while this value persists, there's really no escape from carbon pricing. Carbon pricing has the twin advantages of creating incentives for decarbonization and administering the allocation in ways I think can be actually quite progressive and redistributive in good ways. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael Ash. Now we can go back to the original sequence. We will hear Professor Jomo Sundaram. It's a pleasure to have you here, Professor. He's currently research advisor at Kazana Research Institute. Am I saying right? And he was Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development at the United Nations and is founder chair Ideas. Professor Jomo, you have the floor, please, for 15 to 20 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. While the PowerPoint is being set up, I normally don't give a PowerPoint, so my colleagues were surprised by because when you don't have power, what's the point, right? But in any case, it's a very great pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate Chandru for really fine job in curating this conference. At the same time, while participating in this conference, I feel quite helpless. I feel quite helpless because, as Mark Carney, the current Prime Minister of Canada, reminded us about a year ago, we are going to exceed 1.5 by the end of this decade. Okay, so I think what we should be doing as well, besides talking about these targets and achieving these targets, I think one of our responsibilities as people who are concerned and researchers who are concerned with the issues which we are concerned about is really thinking about Plan B. And Plan B is really a situation of mitigation. We are seeing the likelihood of world economic stagnation, despite some areas of growth, very, very soon. We are seeing the likelihood of increased military spending and probably war, which will exacerbate the tendencies towards global warming. And we are seeing a very bleak situation of reduced multilateral cooperation, and where there is almost complete disregard on many fronts, not just on the climate front, as far as North-South relations are concerned. This, I think, is a very, very serious situation which we need to pay attention to. Allow me to make some brief remarks about the whole question of carbon pricing, about carbon markets and pricing, and why, in a sense, these purported solutions do not stand up to the challenge. And this, I think, is quite important for us to consider very seriously. As you all know, there's a strong desire to find market solutions, especially on the part of the most influential institutions. The preference for market solutions is very much part of the neoliberal era, and we are often still stuck in that discourse. Whereas, in fact, everybody in this room knows that neoliberalism was dead quite some time ago. There has been growing protectionism since the global financial crisis, if not earlier. We have seen a number of very significant tendencies, other tendencies which indicate the breakdown of that neoliberal order, but yet we are still stuck in that discourse. So what I think it's important for us to consider is how that, in a sense, constrains our ability to think more creatively about options and possibilities. It's important for us to recognize that there are two types of emissions. Two types of carbon trading, and in a lot of the popular literature, there is a great deal of misunderstanding and confusion about the relationship between the two. The first is the trading of what are called emissions permits, okay, or sometimes referred to as credit. The second refers to so-called offsets, and these are two which I hope to make a bit clearer. So a lot of the trading, when we talk about carbon trading, is about permission to emit. And this is also one of the big problems is that for the boosters of carbon markets, one of the things they thought would be very helpful to boosting the carbon markets was precisely by underpricing carbon. Okay, so you have, as implied by Professor Asher's presentation, an underpricing of carbon to begin with. So the deterrent effect of the so-called carbon price is compromised right from the outset, okay, by underpricing. And this, I think, is a major problem. So to give you a sense about why carbon trading is particularly problematic, you are commodifying and then you're trying to monetize something which is an artificial creation. And this is also conceptually problematic. Now, if you think about how market volatility affects these so-called carbon prices, consider, for example, that about a dozen years ago, the carbon price was under $4 per ton. In 2020, it had gone up to, sorry, not a dozen years ago, in 2012. Yeah? And then in 2020, the price had gone up to $20 per ton. And then in 2022, it had gone down to $4 a ton again. So you can see that there's tremendous volatility which affects its efficacy as a deterrent. Now, how are these emission permits determined? They're arbitrarily set without rewarding the low emitters of the past and present. In other words, there's no incentive to the countries which have been low emitters. And most of them, as you all know, are from the global south. Not every global south country is like that, but certainly they're mainly from the global south. Now, ironically, the country which has taken carbon markets most seriously and most consistently is China. And in China, you have had a carbon tax rate which began at about $19 per ton. And while other countries, the price has gone down to minus 450. Minus 450. Now, how do you get the figure of minus 450? Because you're providing carbon subsidies. And this was all provided precisely because of the war. Okay? Because you didn't want to, you wanted to keep European on side as far as the war effort was concerned vis-a-vis Russia, and you wanted nobody to raise issues about the bombing of the pipeline and so on and so forth. What you basically did, you subsidized fossil fuels. So the effective price is basically in negative territory. Okay, so you have and more importantly, there is very little evidence that emissions reductions have been significant after over a decade after the implementation of so-called carbon. These are all, I think, important elements. They seem rather straightforward, but the important elements which I think policymakers have to come to terms with. Are we debating something, spending a great deal of energy and time debating something which is so ineffective that it's not even worth debating if you think of the range of possibilities for possible action. So if we think about the EU carbon tariff, which was introduced about 2 years ago, it imposed carbon price on the imports of I'm discussing now the carbon border adjustment mechanism, popularly referred to as CBAM. Okay, so a tariff was introduced, an additional tariff here in existence, in addition to other existing tariffs, was imposed on carbon price of imports. Now, how is the carbon price of imports determined? Okay, it is assumed that the technique of production, the energy intensity of all other producers of the goods concerned is the same. Now, everybody knows that the part of the reason you go to developing countries is precisely because the price of labor is low. Okay, so you use a more labor-intensive process, but you are still charged as if you use the European technique of production. Okay, so you can see how the system itself of CBAM is essentially protectionist. Okay, and so I think it's very important to recognize that there are these problems are partially acknowledged, but they pale into insignificance given what has happened in the last 3 or 4 years because of the war. Okay, now CBAM also claims to prevent so-called carbon leakage by equalizing carbon pricing between domestic production and imports. But as I suggested earlier, the way in which it is operationalized basically discriminates against manufactured imports, energy intensive, the energy content of imports from the south. Now, I would assert, without getting into the details of it, that CBAM is clearly biased. And in addition, it violates WTO rules. Okay, so you have yet another violation of multilateralism. I don't particularly care for the WTO, but if you're going to take the WTO seriously, at least be consistent. Okay, now part of the Trump negotiations right now with particular countries is you agree to a deal. Part of the deal is you don't complain. You don't go to the WTO and say you're violating, because as a member of the WTO, you are obliged to respect the most favored nation status. Yeah, so you don't do that. Okay, so you have multiple violations of whatever multilateral rules there are, but you also have multilateral violation of a plurilateral arrangement, as in the case of Europe. Okay. Sorry, not multilateral. You have unilateral violation, okay, on the part of the Europeans. Now, so you basically have also, which makes it very difficult for developing countries, especially smaller developing countries, to comply, is you have very complex compliance requirements. Okay, for those of you who know this, you're quite aware, especially trade negotiators know this all the time. People who are trying to export the energy, exports with energy content, they know what I'm talking about much better than I could possibly explain, because it is essentially a practical, empirical issue, not something to theorize. Now, the other element, and this is something which we should discuss with Professor Ash, is the whole question of what tariff revenue accrues from all this. Who does it go to? Who does it go to? Does it go to climate action in Europe? No. Does it go to climate action anywhere else in the world, including those countries who are subjected to that tariff? No. So who does it go to? It goes to the general fund in Europe. Okay, so there is not even an element of transfer inter-country. Now, when discussions are held about the possible revenue from all this being transferred, transferred progressively, what is referred to is progressively within the national economy concern. Okay, it does not contribute whatsoever to any kind of international transfers. So we need to be very clear about what we are talking about. Now, and I can fully understand, my old friend Jim Boyce has been writing about this, and he would be the first to tell me that it's almost impossible to get agreement, national agreement for transfers internationally. It's probably true if you go to discuss this issue by itself. But when you test American public sentiment, they think they are contributing so much to the rest of the world. The typical American thinks that they are doing a lot of that. Now, let me quickly run through some of the other issues before I run out of time. Carbon credits. The other kind of market is for so-called offsets. Okay, and these offsets are not widely traded. They have small exchanges rather than big markets, bigger markets, but they are also an important element. But I think one of the important elements to consider is that there is a huge time lag. So the possibility for raising climate finance is very, very limited, precisely because of the very nature of these offsets, because you want to keep your hand on the leash to make sure that developing countries continue not to log or whatever the nature of that offset is. Okay, and I would also suggest to you that there is no empirical evidence that offsets actually reduce emissions. In fact, the system is not even net zero, for those of you who think net zero is something worth achieving and so on. Offsets, in the words of The Economist magazine, which is a conservative magazine, everybody agrees, creates opportunities for cheap cheats. In other words, you're gaming the system, you're cheating the system, but at very low cost. That's what the term cheap cheats refers to. And there have been many cases which have been uncovered of fraud done by BlackRock, by JP Morgan, as well as others. And a CEO has admitted cheating in the case of a forestry case in East Africa. Now, I would also argue that all this much ado about carbon trading has basically has also delayed more the firmer and more rapid action which is needed as far as climate action is concerned. I won't get into all those details right now, but I think it's important to consider how this delay has served to delay quite a number of things. It's also important to recognize that it also serves to distract us from many of the issues which are needed. And if I may quote the former CEO of BlackRock, or is he still CEO? Yeah, he's been changed. So BlackRock, Larry Fink, perhaps on the advice of Tariq Fancy, whom Chandru mentioned yesterday, has basically described it as creating the biggest capital arbitrage of our times. We are lying to ourselves. We are cheating ourselves if we think that this is a solution. Okay, this is not me. This is Larry Fink speaking. Yeah. So, and as I said earlier, there is no compensation for victims and so on. So, okay. So I think we basically have a situation where we are putting a lot of effort into all this. We are like as if we are on the Titanic, okay, and all we are doing is looking for solutions which will not be effective in any to improve all these arrangements is basically not likely, not feasible. The mood in the West, the collective West, if I can say, is very inhospitable. Though, as somebody mentioned earlier today or perhaps yesterday, within less than half a year after the Glasgow COP, said no more coal. Coal mines were being reopened. Coal-fired plants were being reopened. So we have a situation where the world is in very dire straits. The worst victims, as we heard, are the small island developing states in the Caribbean, but also elsewhere. And to use money to measure a lot of the damage which is done is problematic, and we need to recognize that it is problematic. Because let's face it, black lives, brown lives matter, but they matter much less in this kind of economic calculus. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jomo, for this very clear, direct, despite not too much optimistic presentation. Now, I will pass the floor to Mr. Daniel Ortega, who is Executive Director of the Partnership for Agricultural Carbon. He heads the expert panel co-chair, Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, and is former Ministry of Environment of Ecuador. Daniel, prepare. You have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, please bear with me. It's always challenging to have these conversations after lunch. I have seen some of you falling asleep. I will not tell, but I invite you to come back now. And I'm very privileged to join this conversation. Thank you so much for the invitations to the Idea Network and, of course, Professor Chandru for all the efforts of putting this together. Today, I will be sharing with you upcoming research that we are conducting with some colleagues. One of them is a former PhD student here, Pedro Castro. He graduated from Campinas. We have been doing some modeling in energy planning and economic thinking. And with Sandra, she's from Colombia, and we collaborate closely to understand what would be the effect of creating capacity on farmers to make informed decisions about whether or not and how to derive benefits from climate action. So today I will be sharing that information, and before jumping into the presentation, and before you fall asleep, I wanted to perhaps summarize a little bit of the takeaways for you. The first is, as we have been hearing today, and we'll try to avoid the extent possible any repetition, we need between $5 to $7 trillion per year to be mobilized by 2030 to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, they have estimated the social cost of carbon about to be $190 a ton of carbon. If we can think of a signal or a carbon price that can inform decisions on whether or not to allocate public investment, private investment in those technologies efforts, this may be a tool that can be used in cost-benefit analysis. So let us keep it in mind as a relative price that could help achieve what Professor Ash has described, right? That shifting with a Pigouvian perspective to shift the externality and to motivate the adoption of clean technologies, right? That's the whole idea behind carbon pricing, is whether we can resolve the climate problem through internalizing that externality, shifting behavior. So there are many assumptions, right? One is that the market system will facilitate this as a vehicle at the scale needed, at the pace needed. And second, that allocation will result in an efficient allocation at the end of the day. Throughout this presentation, we will be challenging some of those assumptions, making them a little bit more flexible and perhaps introducing a southern perspective. Because as we understand the real politics of this, as Professor Jomo has shared with us, the support for any change in regulation is fragmented, right? In some countries, there is support for a tax. In other countries, there is no support to remove the fossil fuel subsidies. And whether or not you mix all these different type of pricing instruments all together will depend on whether you receive the voting and the support to do so. When at the same time, you may need to disinvest and deal with the stranded assets, as we were discussing in Rio a few weeks ago. A government like Brazil, we have to decide what to do with high-intensive energy sectors and so on. And that comes at a political cost. We saw riots in Bolivia when fossil fuel subsidies were trying to be taken out, even for a progressive government at the time. Third idea that I would like to leave with you is the finance. In broader terms, although we can look at it with critical lenses, it has mobilized sustainability-linked bonds and other sources of similar, let's say, structured fixed income type of instruments. They have mobilized $1.6 trillion only in 2023. Right now, the market is being challenged because of the current political arrangements in the United States, but it continues to grow. So it has shown that it can mobilize finance. We may be able to fix it in a way that avoids greenwashing and really delivers on the expected outcome that we would like in terms of society goals, but it has dwarfed the 100 billion pledge that was set up initially in Paris and most recently in the discussions, in climate discussions. I will try to look through the markets as political shape, the framing, the narrative that we heard yesterday and that we have been hearing earlier today as well, and they remain not to be neutral tools. And it will depend on how every government set out the entire pricing instruments for make them work. From a southern perspective, perhaps we also need to think that the mitigation outcomes, our nations will be the suppliers of this. There is still very limited participation. Besides the UNFCCC negotiations and so on, there is very limited participation of Southern representatives in the different governing bodies making decisions about carbon pricing instruments. And sometimes we are affected by them, like in the case of the carbon border adjustments. And at the end of the day, this is resulting in additional accumulated debt. So the next step that I will finalize today with you, as Professor Luis has shared earlier today, there is a network being set up to conduct further research to generate data and analysis around these issues. So this perhaps will come as an input to shape that. So moving forward in the presentation, let's think about carbon pricing instruments. All the instruments possible, regulations, cap, trade, taxes. Now there are more sophisticated instruments that can become securities and can be financialized. All of that is a mix. Second, it's aiming to achieve a scale. And thirdly, it's allegedly supposed to shift behavior. So as I introduced earlier, let's try to walk through those assumptions and how what type of realities they confront in the practical world. At the top very corner of the screen, you see a mapping of all the different type of pricing instruments being set up across the world. It's back 2022. It has shifted a little bit, but mostly the same. Some of them are under consideration or planned. Some of them are carbon taxes. Some of them are emissions trading scheme. Others are carbon taxes and ETS. The second graph shows the implied pricing introduced by different regulations across the world, as you can see, mostly in northern countries. And the value of that pricing is around $130, so it's a little bit below the social cost that has been estimated by EPA. And the third graph tells you the amount of finance that have been issued in terms of fixed income structured sustainability-linked type of bonds. It's high, it's in scale, and it is perhaps more equally distributed between North and South. But then again, there are political constraints. When you will have support for the tax and when you not. And recent research by Professor Allen and others have shown that in every single scenario, the tax alone will always drive better allocation efficiency in terms of resources than in the initial, when you see this red square, that's the initial timing where you are trying to introduce different type of policy instruments. That when carbon finance makes the difference is when it can be introduced at a scale. Otherwise, every outcome in terms of efficiency is not driving the right decisions. That is, there is no sufficient adoption at the pace needed of renewable energies or clean technologies to replace it. But then the lower axis in this graph also tells you that as long as you continue to introduce taxes and other type of regulations, your voting support is reduced. So that is a real challenge in political terms. What will expect the optimal allocation will be is when you can introduce finance at scale, you can keep the tax, and then you redistribute those resources to those sectors that cannot benefit directly from it. In this next slide, what you see in the graphs is the one on top is the net effect of emissions from traded fossil fuels. As you can see, most of the flows goes directly to China, and some of those goes to the United States. The second graph shows you the net effect of emissions embodied in goods and services. This is a publication in the National Academy of Science paper by Davis, Peters, and Caldeira back in 2011. It was very clear that when you combine those two net effects, both China and the United States, they become center actors. So in any policy arrangement for carbon pricing, in the absence of either two, there's no single point of doing it. Because at the end of the day, the flows and the trades will continue to motivate what we continue to see, and that is more oil extraction and not sufficient adoption, despite the fact that the relative prices for energy, for clean energy, are now much more competitive, right? The cost of installing solar panels, wind energy, and other type of technologies is really has facilitated uptake. But as the large banking sector continues to invest on carbon and extraction, it will not shift. What we see here is that if we would like to map at this present time the amount of carbon credits that are going from global south to global north, there are some empirical constraints that we are facing in accessing that data. But what we have been able to find is that these markets that are introduced externally, sometimes driven by multilateral development banks, sometimes driven by other external actors, are governed asymmetrically and therefore does not provide sufficient space for political support. And in this chart, we have used only 3 countries to show the differences between the price that are being introduced through carbon taxes in countries like Chile, South Africa, and Indonesia. As we heard from previous speakers, the revenue use is not consistently in each of them. Some of them goes directly to general budget. Some of them will go to offset the industry that are hard to abate. Some of them will completely simply fill up the fiscal balances. And there are integrity risks in every case, whether or not these are true reductions taking place, whether or not there is liquidity issues, or whether there are associated controversies with land uses and communities' rights, is still all over the place. So this takes us to what we have defined as the triple threat. And now let me, out of the family of carbon pricing instruments, I'm going to take a little bit more of a deep dive into the voluntary carbon market and ETS systems. As you can see in the graph at your right, the prices of the different trading schemes is completely different. Where a ton of carbon in the European emission trading system would be about $100 per ton, in other platforms is much more lower. And just to give you an example, some of the forest countries, they have engaged with carbon market transactions more recently. The ton on average will be $10 to $12, right? So these are the least cost options. Sometimes are our long-hanging fruits, and we are facilitating them to offset emissions in the global north at a very low price. By the time that many of the binding agreements will be reached and enforced back on us, many of the southern countries will not have that capacity to do it because it will require re-engineering and heavy investments in some industries that we will not be able to afford. So I joined previous discussions earlier today about how to use these instruments, strategically use them and combine them in a way that work for us. So price discovery remains to be an issue. There are economies that will argue that we don't still have carbon markets, because if you look at the different specificities of a carbon, is that you have common rules, that you have a central registry, that you also have access to the information needed to derive those prices, and in carbon markets, that information is not completely there. The second is also the risk of financialization, right? Some have rushed to think that carbon credits can already become a financial asset, therefore they can be part of derivatives, future contracting, and engage in further liquidity exercises that may bring about liquidity, but they also may bring about price distortion because of the narrative associated with them. The third area is integrity risks. In many of the projects associated with generating these credits, it's not completely clear whether the monetary reporting and verification exists, whether there is inflation sometimes in baselines. We have seen some regressivity in the recent trade between Thailand and Singapore. We noticed that it's not only between North and South. Sometimes these trade arrangements can happen between southern countries, but it would come at a disadvantage of the country that is less informed, that has less capacity, and has set up the proper institutional arrangements. And in particular, the case of Thailand and Singapore is bringing a lot of concerns on what this means. And although there are countries that do not believe in carbon markets, prices are still all over the place, right? Even if you receive a resolve-based payments, that is also a price signal. And sometimes when it is not, when it happens over the counter and doesn't go through the markets, it's even lower. So in my case of the country of Ecuador, the results-based payment received because of forest protection is 50% lower of those other countries that have engaged in the mechanism. So moving ahead into an alternative framework to explore these issues, we have recognized the assumptions, and I have already shared them with you about the potential for market to resolve through price signals the issue of the externality. From an heterodox political economy, we understand prices are not performative, but not discovered. And we cannot take it as given. So they may be shaped by institutions, by financial intermediaries, and the narrative and legitimacy behind it. There is growing literature on these areas that is informing this analysis. And from a southern perspective, perhaps exploring power asymmetries between who sets the rules and how these rules are set, it will come as no surprise that further information is needed in that area. And also local institutional and fiscal constraints may be exacerbated by these flows. And there is distributional stakes, right? Who will benefit at the end of the day and who bears the cost? Some will argue that the present time is not only that the carbon is not fulfilling the promise of mobilizing the signals that we need to resolve the externality issue, but also that who are benefiting in this process are the financial intermediaries in between. So some of the recommendations that we are trying to bring to the table is that there is a space and a gap to be fulfilled with our collaboration, like the one that we're having in this workshop, in which we can bring back the political analysis back to carbon, their functionings, the overall management of different carbon pricing instruments, and also perhaps introduce additional elements on the governance, the equity, and the fiscal justice that can be associated with this. Just to give you a few examples, we are exploring questions about the institutional arrangements and the indicators, whether or not these registries are being set up in the right form, in the more political conduit, perhaps whether this market arrangement will be resilient, or the different political arrangements about carbon pricing could be resilient to political shifts. We saw what happened in Brazil after the first term of President Lula. Deforestation went up again, and now we don't know how much in other countries that would be managed. So there is a history of reversals that needs to be factored in these processes. And the third area is about the fiscal levels. So one of the perhaps more positive elements of carbon markets and carbon pricing instruments is when they are not linked back to debt, right? Not public debt or private debt. So in the case of farmers that we are working most closely, if the carbon stream can become an additional revenue, is something that we could explore, because it will also contribute to livelihoods, it will also contribute to fuel security and so on, if the emissions can be delivered in proper manner and the contracts could be negotiated in a way that do not affect their rights. And lastly, on equity terms, whether there is inclusive design of political arrangements about carbon pricing in every country, whether there is an open table to include civil society, different sectors into the conversation. Again, using the case of Brazil, because we are here, the recent discussions about the trading system that will be set up here and the cap and trade, mostly focusing on the energy sector, didn't engage with the agricultural sector on the table. But we understand that to achieve that target, most of the emission reductions internally, domestically, will come from land use sectors. And how we have those interactions in a manner that is inclusive to understand the impact in the different communities, it is of value and can be informed by our research agenda from a southern perspective. This could include embedded price floors that we have not explored so far in pricing arrangements, how to directly link those revenues back to local communities, and perhaps shifting from blueprint replication from institutional arrangements presented by financial institutions to more national and sectoral approaches on how can this work for our own processes. So with that, let me finish to thank you. Perhaps we can think about carbon prices instruments and even giving a try to carbon markets, because they may be able to mobilize finance that would otherwise not be available. The additionality in the context of carbon markets have been discussed for a substantive amount of time. And if we can provide sufficient information and have a collaboration, perhaps price discovery could reach to be more transparent and robust. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Well, staying in Latin America, our last speaker here is from Colombia, Ximena Aristizábal, who is a leading expert in environmental economics and public policy, and currently is a PhD student also at UMass Amherst. Mexico. She said to me. Some problem there. The presentation is not there. Okay, thank you, Ximena, for your presence. 15 minutes, 15 to 20.
Thank you very much, Andre. And yeah, thank you all of you for being here and for this invitation. I think it's awesome to have 3 days to discuss critically carbon finance instruments. So today I'm going to talk about carbon markets and how they have been used for speculation in the end. Okay, I'm going to go through these 3 sections. First, talking a little bit about context. I agree with Professor Jomo that sometimes when we talk about carbon markets, we can be talking about something completely different. There are many angles to look at this. And then I'm going to try to explain in a very broad way what the market structure is. And then discuss and maybe do this like an open discussion with you about the development and environmental effectiveness of these instruments. Talking about the context and the history of these instruments, like we don't have much time, so I just want to mention that carbon markets were introduced both in Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement. And in both, it says that the goal or the purpose of these instruments is to achieve or support sustainable development and also to contribute to the overall mitigation. We know that the main difference between Kyoto and Paris is that in Kyoto, we had some countries that were like the main polluters, industrialized countries that were part of what was called Annex 1. They were listed in an Annex 1. And in Paris, this division does not exist. So every country can contribute to mitigation and adaptation. This graph is the history of CDM, basically, in the way that like I learned it. So you see, let me see, it's working. So around 2003, CDM started, and then the demand was very, very high. So this is what they call the gold rush of CDM. But then they say that the market collapsed. And then there was no demand, and there are some factors that can explain this according to some researchers. And also on the right side, we have this. I made this graph with information from the CBAM database, and this is very consistent. So we have a large number of projects that were registered in the CBAM, and then in 2013 it collapsed. So no, not that many projects. There were some because there was some projected demand from the Paris Agreement. In terms of prices, the behavior is the same. So we see that during this peak, prices were between $10 and $14. This is around 2009. And then it collapsed up to zero. So I say, they say, and I am not including myself in all of this, just because I quite didn't understand or believe in this explanation, because from my point of view and working on carbon markets and carbon policies, what I noticed is that the market did not die. There was instead of that, there was a lot of interest on scaling up the market and consolidating the market. So I was wondering why, if there is no demand, this is a market that does not exist. Who wants to invest in this? And the prices are almost zero. So who wants to work in this market and create more projects? So that is the question I am answering in this paper. And just a little bit more of context. I know that this might be basic, but what is origination? So these markets work on a project basis. So basically, we estimate the business as usual, the baseline, what's happening right now, and compare that against a projection of emissions when we implement the project. And the difference between those two is the number of the volume or the volume of carbon credits that we're going to get. And this is, people say that it's so technical, so complicated, so difficult. And I'd say yes, but it's mainly because it's based on assumptions. So no one knows the future, and it's also hard to model the present because in most of the countries we don't have robust databases. There is not a lot of data. So there are a lot of approximations that are used, and these numbers are difficult to sustain. And well, yeah. So when we get to this number, we can say that that's the number of carbon credits that will be registered in the project. To do a project, this is a very old graph of the project cycle, but Professor Chandru was telling us in the first day that there are many transaction costs associated. So when we talk about these difficult methodologies, usually it's international consultants from the global north who know these methodologies, and then we have validators, verifiers, a group of people, of technicians that will do all of this process, and in the end we will register the project in one of the standards, in one of the markets. And then we implement the project, and after implementation, then there is another process of verification, and finally we will get one carbon credit. One carbon credit then will have a unique serial number. And I also included this, that carbon, they get born when we say that they are originated or issued, and then they need to die. It's the same like when you cash out a check. You use it, you cannot use it anymore. You cannot go to another bank. So carbon credits also need to die, to be retired when they are used for offsetting. This is the market structure. So there are mainly three types of markets. The first one, Professor Michael Lash was talking about them. Cap and trade or like government instruments. The second one, I mentioned Kyoto and Paris international crediting mechanisms. And the third one is a voluntary carbon market. So that's basically a private market that is parallel to the international carbon markets. It was created by the private sector as an alternative to the United Nations system. This would be the supply. This in any of these crediting mechanisms, we can get carbon credits issued. And then this would be the demand. So for the first one, I will not talk about that one because it's usually a closed system. So for example, in New Zealand, they can issue carbon credits and they will not accept Colombian credits to offset their emissions. But in the other two, these are widely accepted. So the units from Kyoto or from Paris were accepted for for offsetting some of the carbon taxes, but mainly the greatest part of the demand come from corporate goals. So we are talking about all these net zero targets. We discussed them. So around more than 2,000 companies have net zero claims. These claims are totally voluntary. No one mandated them. They decided because they are very environmentally and socially responsible to set their own net zero targets. So as they are not mandated by anyone, they are not regulated, they are not oversought. So it's I can say that I want to be net zero and I will buy some offsets. No one will check on me on that. And there are many companies doing that, very large companies, oil companies that decide to be net zero. And this is the largest source of demand for the market, not only from the voluntary carbon market, but also the United Nations framework. Here, when I showed you the graph from the CBAM collapse, you see that this graph is not about registered projects, but it's about issuance. So how many credits were originated? So when you register a project, it can generate credits for over almost 30 years if you renew the crediting periods. So it's a great deal, it's a great investment. So you start here, like you see, this is 2013 with the collapse, but units kept being issued over time, even 2023, and because some of these units will also go to Paris Agreement, they did not die. So these projects will continue generating under Paris. And in black, we see the voluntary carbon markets. So if you see, it's almost like the same graph, but in inverted color. So the market share was completely is completely now provided by the voluntary carbon market. So the unregulated market. If you want to see the number in absolute figures, it's 2.5 billion by 2024 for the CDM and then the voluntary carbon markets. This graph only has 4 of them, the 4 largest markets called Standard, Vera, Plainview, and CAR. But there are so many, and it's impossible to know even how many of them are, because since they are not regulated, there is no single database that consolidates all of them. When we say that these carbon credits are used for the polluters to pollute and then get a permit to compensate for their emissions, I just looked at the UETS because they were some of the largest buyers of carbon credits in the world. And then I realized, using their own data, that actually the companies that bought these credits, they did not use them for offsetting in the UETS. So they were allowed to offset up to 11%, and they only used 6%. So I was wondering what happened. Like, why would someone invest in this market that doesn't have any demand? Prices are zero, and they are not even using it for offsetting. Also, looking at the units that have been retired so far, most of them have been or correspond to these very questionable project types. And that includes REDD+, nature-based solutions, blue carbon. And these projects are questionable, not because protecting the forest is bad, not at all, but making carbon projects out of them is simply, we cannot measure that, and it's what someone will call it's hot air. So they are preserving some forest that was already there, and they are getting credits for that. But it's not a new action. It's not additional mitigation that's occurring. So, and then a company with a private goal will buy them and say that they are carbon neutral. So this system is completely not working. Looking at the aggregate information, there is actually a good database called the Climate Action Data Trust. It is a World Bank initiative. It was called the Climate Warehouse before, and now it's managed by the Singapore Stock Exchange. And they consolidate information from more than 4 markets in the world. If you see from 3.9 billion units that have been issued, only 0.4 have been retired, 0.4% have been retired. What's happening with the rest of them? Doing these projects is very expensive. As we saw, all the transaction costs, it is very hard to get actual data from that, but from the information that's in the CDM, it says that the cost of doing one of these projects is $10 per ton. So you're investing $10 per ton, you're selling it to 0. So every project is basically minus 10. And then it's not being used for compensation, it's not being retired. So what's happening with all of this? So basically what's happening is that they are being hard, it's just pure accumulation, because there are large investors behind this market. So the projection for this market is that it will go to 1 trillion. It will be worth to 1 trillion in 2050. This is McKinsey, Morgan Stanley, Bloomberg, AITA, South Pole projections, and they are projecting that the market will be worth 1 trillion with offsets that cost $0. So yeah, this is what's happening. We are talking about financialization of carbon credits. And yes, so the projects are being used to create new financial products, and they are packaging different types of projects with different levels of risks. So I told you about the very questionable types of projects. They are very well regarded in the exchange market. If you see here, prices can go up to $100. So you're buying carbon credits for almost 0. And then you can create these financial instruments. Someone cut my...
No,
Is it here? Yeah. And then you can sell it in the market for $100. This is a really good investment. So no wonder why someone would like to keep the market alive, want to scale it up. And yeah, and I don't think they are interested in raising the prices of carbon credits that they are paying for the owners in the global south. This is the price of the current price in the spot market. This is 2025. If you see, they are still buying at 30 cents a ton. This is 2025. This is not for the collapse of the CDM. Some of these projects, like Red Plus, yes, they are selling at $8. Yesterday, we heard a figure from the World Bank that they are aimed to sell this new type of instrument for forest at $4. Yeah, but what's the markup for the investors? And I want to almost finish with this graph. I borrowed it from the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market. It was formerly called the Scaling Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets. And I could have done an entire presentation with this because it explains the full model. So here we have developers, of course, in the global south. We have 3 farmers. Farmer 1 says that, or commits, it says here commits to deliver 12 million tons, farmer 2, 10 million tons, 8 million tons. This part is before project development. It's just in the first part of this cycle I showed you. when you register the project, but you have not implemented the project. So you don't have any actual emission reduction, just a registered project. This already has a value in the market. Why? Because you have the commitment, you have a contract signed with these 3 farmers. So what you're selling here in this first part with these financial intermediaries is you're selling forward contracts. Forward contracts are a type of financial instrument that has a very good value in the market. And they are putting all of these contracts into one financial instrument. So very interesting. Yeah, these transactions are, of course, insured. So they're among the organizations interested in this market. We have insurers. So we have investors. This investor will get 20%, 30%, and they are the ones insured. Then the project starts. We are gonna get carbon credits, issuance of credits from this. In this same scenario, first farmer managed to do it, second farmer only part of it, third farmer couldn't do it. So yeah, I'm so sorry, this one will not receive anything. The first one will receive what he was promised in the contract, but all the investors will get back their investment because they were insured. The insurance is not for the farmers, the insurance is for the investors. And then they can sell it. The part that is not here is that they're going to sell it in the secondary market as part of new packages. These new financial instruments are not only for carbon credits, now they are indexing different types of environmental commodities. So we have in one single instrument, renewable energy certificates and carbon credits and environmental conservation targets, everything packaged into one. So when anyone would like to, like, if I buy any of these financial instruments and I would like to look back at the initial project, it is impossible. We cannot see like who's the farmer in that instrument, and these instruments will continue selling into the market until like they increase the price. Another thing is that the transaction costs that I show you, the -10. These are included into the contracts for the initial project owners. So it is them, even if they do not sell anything, the ones that they need to pay for the transaction costs, and that's included in the contract. This is the last slide. So just to say that, we already heard that, but yes, this offsetting or carbon credit market, especially from the voluntary carbon market side, is not actually delivering emission reductions. Of course, it's not delivering development because the markup is not getting into the global south, into the farmers. Maybe part of it for the lucky one, like the farmer one we are showing the graph, but not for most of them. And the prices are very low. They are getting fixed prices, while the investors are getting all the benefits from the secondary market. Maybe I will just stop here because the time is over. Just in the little box is all the efforts that this task force is doing to consolidate the market. And when we hear about all the investment in markets, it's just about making this happen, making heterogeneous or better, homogeneous financial products that will be impossible to track down. Thank you.
Thank you, Ximena. And thank you very much for all the presentations, Professor Michael.
Thank you.
Professor Jomo, Ximena, and Daniel, thank you very much.